So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to the launch of Akram Aylisli's novel, People in Trees. My name is Roman Kostovsky, and I'm the publishing director at Plum & Press. And we are a DC-based nonprofit dedicated for promoting high-quality English translations of literature from Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. Our staff has the ability to read in 12 languages. We've published 13 books so far, 1 music album, and they're featuring writers and poets from Romania, Ukraine, the Czech Republic, North Macedonia, Poland, Latvia, and most recently, Azerbaijan. Before I hand over the mic to tonight's moderator, Joanne Ackerman, I'd like to thank the Writers Center for providing us with the space for this launch. I'd like to thank the Alan Schuss Center for International Writers for its unwavering support for our mission and its tireless promotion for international writers in the greater Washington, D.C. area. I also want to thank Walter Carlton, who's sitting there in the audience, for his wonderful artistic talent. He is the one that created the cover for this book. I would like to also thank our managing editor, Rachel Miranda. Unfortunately, she's not here. She's in Jersey. And then a special thanks goes to Kate Young for her outstanding translation of this novel. And, you know, if you cut this book with a knife, it would bleed Kate's blood. And lastly, I want to express my gratitude to Thomas DeWall, who took the time from his busy schedule to come and discuss Aylisli's work, and to Joanne Ackerman for moderating this event. Joanne is a novelist, short story writer, and a journalist. Her notable works include The Far Side of the Desert, Burning Distance, The Dark Path to the River. She's also been honored with several awards for her commitment to human rights and social justice. And she also serves as vice president of PEN International. Now, before I give you the mic, I'd like to ask everybody to shut down their phones if they can, so that we don't disturb the panel. And it doesn't sound good on film either. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Roman. This book is just a real treasure, so I hope everybody will buy it at the end and help Plum & Press continue. But first, let me just introduce Catherine Young, who translated the book. And she is former poet laureate emerita of Arlington, Virginia. She's a poet as well, a translator, a very noted translator of Russian literature, and has written many poems as well. And then Thomas DeWall is a British journalist, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Europe, and has written himself a book, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War, and The Great Catastrophe. I love that title. I haven't read the book, but that sounds like an interesting title. And I have done work with PEN International for decades, including work with on the human rights and writers in prison. And we won't speak a lot about that tonight because we're really talking about literature and the bridges that literature can bring between societies. But I do just have to note that this wonderful Azerbaijani novelist, probably the most noted in Azerbaijan, wrote a book. This book came before that, but then wrote a book and relating to Armenia and the Azerbaijanis, and it inflamed many people, including the government. And he essentially has been under house confinement for the last more than a decade. He's 86 years old, living in Baku. But we hope that this book will liberate and expand the recognition of him and his literary work, because really he is a writer. And I thought I'd just read one quote that he said. A couple of quotes I think are very moving and telling about writers. He said, "It is possible to live through literature. There is a lot of air there. What remains is the life of the mind, even if you're locked up." And he says, "I have no enemies because I'm a writer. I'm here to just think any thoughts and write them down." And I think that's an important context to put this in. I've asked Catherine if she'll give a brief sort of synopsis of this novel, which is one of his earlier novels, and read a few pages so you can actually hear the words on the page, and then we'll begin discussing. So Catherine, over to you.
So thank you, Joanne. This is a collection of 3 novellas and a short story. It's called People and Trees, and the themes of people and trees do run through them. They are a coming of age. They're sort of sequential coming of age story told first by a very young boy, preschool age. Then the second novella is told during the school years, and the third one is when he is just finishing school and about to go off to Baku into the wider world and become, a student at the institute. So there's a progression there. It's a very interesting time. It's set just during and after the Second World War in Azerbaijan. There are many Azerbaijani experts in this room, and I hope I don't mess up the history too badly, and I apologize in advance if I do. But essentially, Azerbaijan, and this part of Azerbaijan, Nakhchivan, from which Akram Aylisli himself comes, was part of the Russian Empire, and later was caught up in all of the troubles of the First World War, the coming of the Soviets, and then the social policy that they brought in of collectivization, collecting the land, removing private property, emancipating women. And if you think about it, that all happened within the space of about 20 years, and then we had the Second World War. And during the Second World War, an entire generation of men was lost as cannon fodder for the Soviets. So you have women who were born, say, in 1910 in a traditional patriarchal Muslim society in the mountains, and they went through all of this, and by 1945, there was nobody but them to run the place. So it's a tremendously interesting period. Akram Aylisli himself was born in 1937. His father was one of those men who died in the Second World War, and he was raised primarily by women, including his mother, who he considers and talks about as the town storyteller. So this set of novellas, which were written in the late 1960s, this is his first major work, are really extraordinary in that they are depicting the world of women, everyday women's lives, the challenges that they're meeting in this extraordinary period of time when everything that they were raised to do and think about was overturned. So it's a marvelously rich period to write about, and he writes about it and about a women's experiences with tremendous empathy, and that's one of the things that draws me most to these novellas. So I'm going to read now from the fourth part of the book. So they're the 3 novellas, and they're followed by a little story, a short story called The Tale of the Silver Tweezers. And it is, I think you'll hear, I hope you'll hear in the prose, Akram Aylisli went off to study in Moscow in the late 1950s at the Gorky Literary Institute, which was the famous place that anybody who wanted to be a writer in the Soviet Union went. And he happened to be there at an interesting time called the Thaw, and was a fellow student with people like Yevgeny Yevtushenko and Bela Akhmadulina, some of the most important poets of the latter half of the 20th century. And he went planning to be a poet, but he didn't end up doing that. But I think you'll hear in his work that the sort of sounds and cadences, the music of his poetic interests haven't left him. So this is called The Tale of the Silver Tweezers, and this is the first 2 little parts. My father sold muskmelons from the collective farm in the district center, and we saw him only in the evenings. There was just our house then. There was the yard of shady trees. There were the mountains and the sun. There was me, and there was my grandmother. We also had a cow who, like my father, went out in the morning and came back only in the evening. Everything else was out there, beyond our fence. There were different houses on the other side of the fence, different trees, different people. There were big kids there. They hit the little ones. There were scary dogs there. They bit the little ones. There, beyond the fence, weddings took place. People rejoiced. There were also funerals, funeral feasts. People cried. There was me, and there was my grandmother, and in the evenings, my father and the cow came back home to us. There was also another place, the other world, and on Thursday nights when we lay down to sleep, my grandfather would come from that other world to visit us. On Thursdays, my grandmother soaped and scrubbed the whole house. She shook out my grandfather's black kurgan bag and hung it on a nail in the room. She turned down the wick of the lamp and placed it to burn in the hallway, trying to keep it secret from my father. My father grumbled when he saw it because kerosene was expensive and heavy to carry from the district center. And then, you all know, my father didn't believe in any kind of other world or any kind of God. My father slept alone in the small room. My grandmother and I slept here in the big room. And on Thursday nights, the lamp burned nervously in the hallway next to our room, trying to stay hidden from my father. I was also nervous on those nights. I was very afraid of my grandfather, although my grandmother insisted that he wasn't frightening at all. He'd never in his life scared anyone, never said boo to a goose. That's the kind of man he was. And he didn't walk among us to scare us. He was checking on us, seeing how we were doing, whether we had kerosene, whether we had enough bread. And he was also finding out whether we'd strayed from the path of the righteous. And because my father had strayed from the path of the righteous, my grandmother turned her face to the heavens each time she completed her prayers, urging God at length to forgive my father for his sins. My grandmother even taught me the prayer. I also began to beseech God. Lord, I'd say, repeating my grandmother's words, you are merciful and just. Forgive my father. You see yourself that they've worn the man down, always on the run. Everyone treats him badly. Forgive him his sins. Show your mercy. My grandmother said that my prayer would reach the Almighty quicker because I was an innocent child and because the angels that sit on everyone's shoulders hadn't yet inscribed a single sin on my forehead, and that God had to forgive my father because my father didn't eat stolen food. He earned his bread by the sweat of his brow. There were certain people whom God would never forgive: thieves, haters, blasphemers, those who wrote words on the mosque and washed dirty things in the spring. But at that time, those people were a long way away from me, a very long way, on the other side of the fence. There was yet another kind of place on the other side of the fence, school, where the bell rang over and over. There was a shop on the other side of the fence near which people always shouted, quarreling over kerosene. There were all kinds of things on the other side of the fence, but all of them were a long way away, a very long way. There was me, and I had a grandmother, and the two of us understood one another very well. When the sparrows twittered in the crowns of trees or the magpies screeched, we were certain that they were talking among themselves. I was certain, and my grandmother was certain too. In the evenings when the sun sank behind the mountain, neither of us doubted that the sun was going to sleep. We both knew every single one of the magpie chicks that nested in the old pear tree, my grandmother and I. Catching sight of a bat, we'd both freeze in fear, my grandmother and I. And it was only on the other side of the fence that my grandmother became different. She knew everyone there. I didn't know anyone. She wasn't afraid of anyone. I was afraid of everyone.
Good. Beautiful. It just shows you that it just takes you into the culture and what a bridge literature can be for all of us to, explain. I often tell students and others that if you want to know a society, study their culture, study their literature, study their history, and then study their great novelists, because it brings it all together. Thomas, why don't you tell a little bit about your experience with Azerbaijan and your reading of Aylisli?
I mean, first of all, let's recall. Sorry. First of all, great to be here, and congratulations, Kate, on a wonderful book and on Plum and Press on a beautiful product. I'm so glad to be here, and so glad that my schedule, I'm not often in DC, coincided with this evening. But you know, we're talking about a place, Nakhchivan, which is about as far from the center of the Soviet Union as you can get. It borders Iran and Turkey. It's actually doesn't even border the rest of Azerbaijan. Geographically, it's the kind of Alaska of Azerbaijan,
Okay.
which is separated from the rest of Azerbaijan by Armenian territory, the way the Bolsheviks, all these disputed territories, and you know, this one was given to Soviet Azerbaijan, and next door was Soviet Armenia, even though they weren't actually, it wasn't actually contiguous with the rest of Azerbaijan. So I think that's something we need to appreciate, that he's not just an Azerbaijani, Akram Aylisli. He's from this very specific place, and he writes about Azerbaijan is a place of many regions. Regional identity is strong. We've got some Azerbaijanis in the room who, if I don't want to put them on the spot, but if you ask them where they're from, they have these multiple regional identities through their families, their parents, and so on. And so he's capturing something very specific. And in his later work, the controversial work Stone Dreams, he's again writing about Nakhchivan, but he's writing, as he doesn't in this book, he's writing more controversially about it as a mixed Armenian-Azerbaijani region. And he's therefore breaking a taboo that these two people are adversaries, that Armenians are enemies. He's writing about a mixed community, a village he grew up in which had a church as well as a mosque, the village of Aylis. His actual surname is not Aylisli, that's his pseudonym, Aylisli, and the man from Aylis.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I think, and we're getting the flavor of someone who has multiple identities. He's an Azerbaijani writer, he's a Soviet writer, but he's a man from Nakhchivan, and he's a man from the village. And I think this kind of village literature, which we just don't have in English. I think possibly the French have it a bit. You know, if you read many of us know those films, you know, Jean de Florette or Manon des Sauces, you know, about village life. In English, you'd have to go all the way back to kind of Thomas Hardy to get something of that description of people who are close to the soil, in which animals are characters in the book as much as people are. So this is, I think, this unique identity from Akram Aylisli. And then he's also a Soviet writer who went in the 50s to Moscow, became fluent in Russian, actually wrote in Russian as well, where he bonded with all sorts of people from all across the Soviet Union. There was actually this village writers' school, which a lot of them were Russians, and in some ways his soulmate, and the writer he's most akin to, is actually an Armenian writer called Hrant Matevosyan. Same generation, also writes about a village, this time in Armenia, but also the same humor, the same lyricism, the same animals participating. So this is, I think, it's wonderful to have this book in English because it's capturing many, many different things at once. It's capturing this transition from rural life to modernity in the Soviet Union. It's capturing this old culture, which is in transition, but he's still celebrating with all this humor. So I think we've got something very, very special here. And I've met Akram Aylisli just once. I think others in the room possibly have met him more than that. We spent a wonderful few hours together. And indeed, he is a kind of a bit of a caged animal, unfortunately, living in his apartment in Baku. Doesn't go out much, lives there with his family. He could go out to the rest of Baku, but you know, his passport is taken away. He was this great Azerbaijani national writer, on good terms with all the leaders, until he kind of broke the taboo about talking about Azerbaijan's dark spots, the pogroms against the Armenians and so on, for which suddenly he was vilified and not forgiven.
We might add in that in Stone Dreams, he did it not as a journalist, but with a novel where he just had
Exactly.
a sympathetic character. So it was empathy that he was seeking
Exactly.
through a novel. And so it really was not political, except that he showed the Armenian as a human being and the Azerbaijani as a human being. And for some reason that enraged the society, as I understand it.
He's not an activist. He's not a crusader. He's a writer who writes it as it is, as all good writers do.
Yeah, so that's good. Catherine, can you talk a little bit about what it was to translate this? Because it was, my understanding, it was from Azerbaijani to Russian to then English, or
Right.
the journey of the translator, I think, is interesting.
Yeah, this book was originally translated into Russian quite soon after it was published. In fact, it may have first been published in Russian in the early 1970s. And I have not been to Azerbaijan. I don't speak Azerbaijani. I'm kind of an odd person to be putting this book in English, although, of course, that was very...
We're going to correct that. We're going to go to Azerbaijan together.
Right.
I'm putting it on the record.
I very much want to do that. But in some ways, given this writer and given his situation, someone who is closer to Azerbaijan, for example, a Western scholar, might encounter some difficulty going back to do their scholarly work if they're translating a writer who is out of favor with the authorities. And, we can argue about how much. I can tell you that even for this book, which is just coming out, we have had people refuse to review it because they are afraid that they won't be able to go back to Azerbaijan to do their scholarly work. And obviously, another thing I should mention is the last book that was even associated with Azerbaijan in a literary sense to sort of make it into American consciousness in any case was the novel Ali and Nino from 1937, which was apparently not even written by an Azerbaijani. Apparently the author it was published under a pseudonym, and the author was a Jewish man from Kiev. But the point...
from Baku.
Was he from Baku?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is why we have experts in the room. I'm just the translator.
There's actually a book called The Orientalist by Tom Rees. If you want to know about the author of
Kurban Said.
Said, you should.
Right.
His original name was Lev Nussenbaum.
Yes.
So if you want to know about, that's a remarkable book, The Orientalist, about him.
Yeah, the whole story is just fascinating. But the point that I wanted to make about that is that there is not a community of literary translators living in Azerbaijan who could get this material into English. And there is not even an audience here for it. There is no money coming out from Azerbaijan to support literary translation in any language that I know of, as there is from many other countries, for example, France, Spain. A number of countries support the translation of their literature into English. There's nothing like that here.
Even though they're not short of money in Azerbaijan. But.
Right. But I'm assuming that even if there was that kind of support in Azerbaijan, that it might not go to this particular writer who has managed to irritate quite a number of people. So in any case, what I'm saying is the closer you are to Azerbaijan, the more reasons you have not to translate this book. And since I am not that close to Azerbaijan, the closest I've been is Tbilisi, which is several countries away. So I got an email in 2014 after Akram Aylisli's books had been burned in Azerbaijan from a mutual friend in Moscow saying, this is a writer you need to know about, and these are books that need to be translated into English. And that's how my journey began with him. So I work only from the Russian translations. The later novellas, he translated into Russian himself. And that, for me as a translator, felt like a way safer thing because I could communicate with the writer and I could, I could ask about words. And those novellas tended to be more political. And so I really wanted to be careful in what came into English and how it was expressed. I didn't want to make anybody's life more difficult by making a bad translation. These novellas, however, have been around a while, and they're not political. And while there were moments that I really wished I was working with Aylisli's own translation so that I could ask him about why a particular word was this way. In general, I felt these were easier to translate. I didn't feel the political pressure to make sure that the word was right. It felt freer, and I've also grown as a translator. I was a language major, and when you're a language major, you are very narrowly kept to what's in the dictionary. There's a word in Russian, there's a word in English, and that's the word you use. But what you learn as a literary translator, of course, is you need to go away from that. You need to walk away from the words as words, and you want to walk into the emotion and thought and the vision of the writer. And if that sometimes that means walking away from the literal meaning of any particular word. And for this book, which is so lyrical, and there's so many beautiful descriptions of the landscape, and there's a lot of, it's not specifically geared toward folklore, but there are many folkloric motifs and many uses of language that evoke, as you probably heard, folklore and storytelling. All of that for a poet to translate was just so exciting, and it was beautiful. And for the 2 or 3 moments when I wished I could have, checked with him on a particular word, in general, I felt like that aside, translating this one was way easier. I don't know whether that's because I'm not being careful enough anymore. I don't know, but it flowed. I felt more on the wavelength maybe of these books.
Well, the wonderful thing is it has the rhythm of literature, so we just assume it's the two of you together because you're not aware of it, a translated work. You're just aware of a beautiful piece of literature, which I think means you did your job.
Well, that's what we're supposed to do. I should say that there's one thing that kept going through this, one motif that goes through this book of people cracking walnuts with their hands. And I did actually write him in Russian to ask him, do they crack walnuts with their hands? And he kind of wrote back and said, well, of course.
Of course, yeah.
So then I'm on this, because the thought of cracking a walnut with you. So anyway, I went on an internet search, as one does, and there is a little video from a guy in Glasgow, Scotland. I don't know how he knows this, but he's made this whole video of how you crack walnuts with your hands. And so now I know.
But maybe Nakhchivanti walnuts are a bit softer.
I think probably when they're closer to the tree and before they've been packaged and sent halfway around the world. Yes, probably.
Yeah. I thought I'd read this quote, which I just sort of summarized at the beginning, but now that you've given the context with the reaction that came from Stone Dreams, this is what Aylisli says. Armenians are not enemies for me. How could they be? I am a writer living in the 21st century. I want to contribute to the peaceful solution. Where have you seen a writer as a patriot? He must write everything his mind and reason tells him to. So I think that's just a very good summary for writers, especially if you are, and I think maybe not many here, but in the U.S. as much, but in many countries, the writer should be free to think, and the imagination is always the enemy of the authoritarian because you can't control it. And so, he says a good writer is never alone because they live in the life of the mind, and I think that's important. So I hope you probably found that when you met him.
Sure, and I think he was like any person in that situation, but particular writer was consoling himself by reading the life of the mind.
He says literature fills his days. You can live in literature. And I think
he was particularly enjoying reading the more, he was reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez and things like that. Sort of things which would take him way beyond his particular moment in space in Baku. I think he was possibly even translating.
He does.
Marquez.
I have been to Baku, but I didn't meet him. I was there in an odd situation at a wrestling tournament, and I think I was the only woman in the world championship there. But that's another story. But anyway, what are you working on next, the two of you, in terms of your own work?
I write about current affairs and politics. I do have one literary translation under my belt of Osip Mandelstam, but that was a very personal project, which took me many years to complete, and I don't know that that's to be repeated. But otherwise, I write about.
Well, he has a definite small poem. I remember. I don't think I can quote it because he, of course, was incarcerated in Russia, and he talks about the prison being your life starting in the size of a shoe, and that was essentially where I can't quote his beautiful little tiny poem, but I remember of his. Yeah, Catherine?
Yeah, and Tom's actually, I'm going to put a plug in for your Tricia, because his collection, the collection of Mandelstam that he published, was Mandelstam's second book. It was published in 1922 in Germany without his approval. And so Tom kind of went into the weeds to kind of figure out where these poems came from and put them in an order that worked. And it's a real work, not just of literary translation for the poetry in it, but of scholarship for people who want to find out more about Mandelstam. It's a really valuable, and it's hard to believe that here we are in, when did that come out, 2023? Mm-hmm. And so for 101 years, nobody had translated that book into English.
Well, they translated many of the poems, but not the whole book.
But not as a book.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So, yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
And you, what did you say?
Next. Well, there is the publicity tour for this book. I wish. If anybody wants to write a review, we are looking for reviewers. As you may have heard, we had some trouble. I am working on a collection of short stories by the Russian writer in exile, Anna Starobinets. But it is, as many of you who may know something about Russian translation these days, the bottom fell out of the world for us, because most of the work that was published in English over the last 10 or 15 years was in some way or another subsidized by either an oligarch or the Russian government by grants. And those grants were made to the publishers, which was great for those of us who needed to publish Russian books in translation. And we had a sort of steady output of about 60 books a year. But with the full-blown Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the sanctions, that money stopped. And many of us who had, shall we say, our consciences had pricked us before, but not enough to keep us from publishing the books and taking the money, because otherwise they wouldn't get published and our writers wouldn't get read. And it's not their fault that their government was doing terrible things. But in any case, the money stopped. And of course, no publisher in America wants to take on a book from a Russian writer at this point, because they can't sell them. So we're in really dark times for people who translate from Russian. And some of the more creative people have broadened their language skills. I know a number of people who are learning Ukrainian. Other people, which is more of what I do, are looking at works from what we used to call the Soviet periphery, which is not what the people living in those places thought. There's a whole legacy. Georgia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, right? There's this whole legacy of colonialism in the approach toward the literatures of this part of the world that we are only beginning to reckon with. I was at the Scholarly Conference, which is going on right now in Boston, but last year on this subject area of sort of the post-Soviet universe. And the whole theme of the conference was decolonizing our work as post-Soviet scholars and thinking about the world. And it was, people were struggling, you know, to think in the year 2024, over 30 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, that we're still looking at so much of the cultural and other history of this world through the lens just of Moscow is really shocking. And all of us bear some, including me when I was a graduate student. I didn't think there were, the guy who was interested in the nationalities, the Caucasus, Central Asia, was way down in the worst office at the far end of the hall and had like 3 graduate students, and we didn't hang out with them because they were the uncool kids, right? And I mean, these were just this way of thinking was inculcated.
But that was the exciting part. You know, I was the one who started
to be the uncool kid.
I'm a Russianist who started in the center and moved to the periphery because I found it much more satisfying and have, you know.
You know what's interesting? I've been involved with PEN International for decades and decades, and of course the the charter begins that literature should know no bounds and shouldn't be bound. The writer should not be, you know, in a sense, identified by his nation, and you know, it's the life of imagination and creativity. But of course, we all would get locked into our national linguistic parts of the world. So an important question is, what is the role of place and of memory and of the universal ideas that you feel that Akram Aylisli has shown that really makes him a writer of the stature that he is, that isn't bound by his nation?
Well, I mean, he's such an interesting character because, of course, most of his writing life was in this colonial universe where things came from Moscow. and to get and he could travel around the Soviet Union and in other places as a Soviet grandee, as it were, and a representative of Soviet literature writ large. And when it became clear that he couldn't publish his later novellas in Azerbaijan, what did he do? He sent them to St. Petersburg and to Druzhba Narodov, the journal, and they published his novellas in Russian because they couldn't be published in their own language in a commercial sense back in Baku. So he's really kind of played.
But I mean, I would add that the Soviet Union was not the Russian Empire. It was very paradoxical. There was this element of the Russian Big Brother, but it was also, there's this book called The Affirmative Action Empire about the Soviet Union, that it actually, in the 20s, and then that went into reverse, but again in the post-war period, there was this massive production supporting of all the other languages and cultures of the Soviet Union. There was a bit of deference to Russia as the center, but there was a lot of space for writers and in all the other in Union republics, as they were known. And there was a whole massive industry of Armenian, Georgian, Azerbaijani culture. There were certain limits to what you could say, but the Georgian film industry of the 60s, 70s, 80s, it's unsurpassed by what happened since independence, sadly, because there was state subsidy for that kind of culture.
I mean, also a deep tradition of great literature in Russia as well.
So the paradox is that in those days there was this censorship and restriction, but there was also subsidy, which actually someone like Aylisli, and he talks openly about this. He says the Soviet Union meant that a village boy like me could go all the way to Moscow, and that wouldn't happen nowadays. A village boy nowadays from his village would stay a village boy or best, scrape a living, unfortunately, in Baku.
Yeah.
So another perspective on this, and this isn't my perspective, this is my friend Shelley Fairweather Vega, and it was just one of these mind-blowing moments when she said this, which is she was working with writers from Uzbekistan and saying, for Uzbekistan, Russia was on the periphery. Uzbekistan is the center, right? And you think about these cultures like Armenia, which adopted, I think was the first culture to adopt Christianity in the 4th century, or Georgia, where the epic poem was written in the 1100s, and Azerbaijan, whose tradition is both Turkic and Iranian or Persian, and that poetic tradition goes back to times before Moscow was even a little hut on a hill. So, when you are growing up in these cultures, it's not like they're unknown, faceless, unexplored. It's just that we on the outside may not have paid attention to them. But when you're talking about Akram Aylisli, I mean, he's, centuries and centuries and centuries of writers, writing in the language that he's still writing in. Oh. So, I mean, but that's kind of hard to sell to a publisher in Illinois who's doesn't really know where Azerbaijan is on the map,
or even in New York,
or even in New York. Yes.
Maybe let's open it up if there are questions from the audience. Okay, so not everybody will have read this book because it only came out on Tuesday, so but some may have read Farewell Aylisli, yes, which I actually had read, or just have questions about the region. Yes. Yes.
Microphone or just? I don't have a question.
Okay.
Just one maybe follow-up.
Are you going to introduce yourself?
I'm always Washington-based analyst.
From Azerbaijan.
But yeah, so Akram, one thing that to know Akram is that he grew up in that village, which dreams, you would know that it was a large Armenian town, even though the village, until early 20th century, when strives based on collective memory, there was a big pogrom or a genocide orchestrated by Ottoman troops, and so he grew up in that village, as he writes. I saw that I come from the same region. I used to go there. I knew Akram from my childhood. So there were 12 churches in Aylis just before demolition stopped in 1999. early 2000s. So he grew up with that, and there were still Armenian villages nearby. So Ordubad was a really ethnic mixed place, along with other parts of Nakhchivan. So he was a true internationalist. It's not coming that it's a policy ideology, but when you grow up with mixed region, with this beautiful landscape, Rocky Mountains, and then beautiful churches on the top, you love it, and that's what made him to write that book, because he was, he was internationalist, he was skeptic of those independence movement of 1988, which was based at battle with Armenians. It wasn't about first state independence. It was about, no, we're not going to give you Karabakh. So he was skeptic of that. He wrote to his friends in Moscow that no one understands me in my culture, because he was one of the two maybe intellectuals who was against this mess. And when that government, which was popular government, fell, he didn't like that government, he started to sympathize Aliyev the senior, because he thought he has Soviet background, he's going to bring again at least some friendship or peace, etc. But when he became MP, but then in 1999 he gets called from his village that they're demolishing his churches. They're putting bombs and blasting because they're so solid they can't demolish it. He resigns from it. He writes a letter. If you read the press of that time, 2000, I am talking about 2003, 2004. He resigned from MP. He returned all his medals and whatever he had from Aliyev, and he wrote that book. That's when he wrote something. So it's not like he wrote this to make a fame, or he wrote this to make because he has sympathy to internationalists. He's internationalist. He believes in friendship with people, truly believes it, and that was right. So it's short remark.
Thank you. That's very helpful. It also is reminiscent of so many different places, such as in the Balkans, where the Serbs and the Croats, but they all lived together, and then suddenly they couldn't live together. And other places where, politics gets in the way.
And he's the memory and conscience of that past,
yes,
which people are trying to forget.
Yes, right. The humanity of us all. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah. It's helpful.
And I should also say maybe that Aylisli was a town on the Silk Road. So I mean, it really has been international, not just as his memory, but for centuries.
The other famous person from Aylisli was actually an Armenian artist called Lucina, I think, Agulesya, yes, which also means from Aylisli, but she went to Yerevan, and there's a little museum of her works in Yerevan. She's no longer with us. I'd love to have, when I found out about Aylisli and her, I wanted to meet her, but it was too late, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Any other questions, thoughts? Yes?
I just wanted to remind you, because it goes into the camera. Thanks. Lawrence Burroughs, researcher from UK. Can you tell us a little bit about the early career of this collection of works of people and trees? How was it received initially, the early publication of the work? And how was it seen as fitting into the defining parameters of Soviet literary genres of the time that the money was produced?
I can answer the first part of that, and I think maybe you can answer the second.
Not really, but
okay, we'll try. Between us, we'll try. So the first part of it was his first big publication after he'd studied in Moscow, come back to Azerbaijan, and he worked as an editor and many other things. But he was always planning to be a writer. And it was in that period in the Soviet Union when we were talking about the Brotherhood of Peoples. The book was published in print runs that are just for American writers who just want to weep. They were, 100,000 copies of this book, was published in Russian. But then it was published all over the captive world of Eastern Europe. So this book,
Roman read it in Czech.
Right. And many of people read it in Russian. In fact, my friend Olga Zilberborg, who was the person who convinced me to translate it, had read it as a child in Russian. And she said, you have to translate this book. It's so important. So it was sold in millions of copies throughout the former Eastern world. There was a film made from the second novella, which you can see, unfortunately not in Russian or English, but you can see it in Azerbaijani on YouTube, The Tale of the Pomegranate Tree. And if you read the book, the film is very, very close, so you can follow along even if you don't speak any of the languages. So this was his big debut. And then he got on to other things. In terms of where this fits, I am not an expert on the village prose movement. The village prose movement in Russian or Soviet literature was based in these villages, and a number of different writers, many of them of Russian heritage, not necessarily Azerbaijani heritage, were writing these stories about where they came from. The movement became gradually over the years more and more and more conservative. And I think I have trouble saying that this is Akram Aylisli's whole movement, but that is probably what he grew out of. But especially, when we got into the 80s and 90s, the people who had written these groundbreaking stories were also the people who were sort of Russian conservatives. Right. And so they were not so interested in the people from the other republics who were writing stories about their villages.
And talking of films, I would very much recommend a 1969 Armenian film called We in Our Mountains. It's a really beautiful and funny film with the great Armenian actors of the day, based on a novella by Hrant Mativosyan, who's, as I've already mentioned, is kind of Akram Aylisli's kind of Armenian soulmate and friend, I believe, who sadly died in 2002. It would be great if he was still with us. But that's really is also very much captures this village school. It's a film about a bunch of shepherds up in the mountains, and they steal, as a bit of a prank, someone else's sheep and eat it. And the man whose sheep is stolen is a bit offended, but doesn't want to take it any further until an interfering village policeman who is kind of from tries to kind of impose Soviet law and order on this dispute and gets completely lost in it. So there was obviously enough. It was the Thaw era. It was the 50s and 60s. There was enough kind of a margin of freedom at that point that you could satirize a bit the Soviet bureaucracy if you're doing it from the position of the people who were working, who were the true peasants, and so that's I think that's the flavor you also get in this book.
In this book, for sure. I mean, the people, the villains, as it were, are the sort of the people from the Soviet central planning, whatever, that gets sent down to make the collective farms merge, even though there is no point in a mountainous farm merging with a wheat farm. I mean, it just and it's very gentle, but there's a tension in there between
famine in there.
There's famine in the war. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that kind of goes wrong at the sort of above the local level, but all the local people are affected by it. There are many months, many years in these novellas when the collective farm doesn't make enough profit to pay its workers. So what are people supposed to do? They all have to steal. They have to carry bags with them when they go to work to be able to steal stuff so that they have enough food for their families to eat. So it's a very, I would say, genial, this particular book is a very genial critique in a very soft way of...
It's not a protest novel.
No, not at all.
But you get the feeling
Not at all.
how
No, but
hard it was.
he's pushing
How
pushing the bounds of what's possible.
Yeah, definitely for that time period, definitely. Yeah. Anybody else?
Anybody else? Yes?
Are there any other books of his that are due to be translated?
Not at this point, but I'm always interested if anybody wants to fund the translation. So I mean, he has. These are the novellas from early in his career, and then there's the set that I translated some time back that is the novellas of his later career. But I understand he's written at least one since 2016, which I have not translated. I have not seen. I'm asking for it. It's kind of a tough sell, when you go to a publisher and say, I have this marvelous writer from Azerbaijan, all I can say is, if you have publisher friends who were broad-minded, encouraged them, like Rahman, to take on something that maybe wasn't what he was thinking about when he started publishing, but I mean, look, it wouldn't matter to me where it was from. It's even more, I think, than the later novellas. This work is just lyrical and beautiful, and it tells universal human stories. I don't want to say that. I don't want to reduce it to that, but it tells stories that we can all relate to. It's not a political novel. It's just my uncle was born in the same year as Aylisli. My uncle just died recently, but they both grew up in these mountain communities on a farm, and the resonances for me as I was translating this book and thinking about how different their lives were. One became a Soviet era intellectual, and one stayed a dairy farmer all his life, right? But these are stories of our families, maybe our ancestors. Rich Kauslerich, who was one of the ambassadors to Azerbaijan and who has read this book and wrote about it, said this reminded him of the people he knew growing up in the 1950s on the family farm in Illinois. So these are maybe not within our living memories, but within our parents' living memories. And they're stories that you don't have to know anything about Savnarkhoz or how the Soviet agricultural industry worked. They're just stories about people encountering problems and finding creative solutions to them, and loving along the way and hating along the way and fighting, and somebody breaks the tail of somebody's or the leg of somebody's hen, and that's a problem in the village. Somebody comes back home from war years after he was thought dead, and that creates a lot of problems because he's got both a wife and a mistress. These are everyday stories.
Yeah. Also, the book Farewell Aylisli has three novels, so it's not just Stone Dreams, but there are two others within that book.
Yep. Yeah. And one of my favorites is called Yemen. It's a story. It's a Soviet era story about patronage and privilege, and also falling out of the good graces of those in authority. But there's a book on the first page that he sees on the bookshelf, and it's got an Azerbaijani author on the back of it. But in fact, he looks just like William Faulkner. And the book is all through the book. This is running joke about William Faulkner and also Neil Armstrong, who comes to the main character, and they have a metaphysical discussion in the middle of the night under the light of the moon. So Aylisli is indeed a universal and international writer. He is conversing with people throughout time and space, even if he didn't actually meet them.
Meet William Faulkner.
Sorry?
Even if he didn't meet William Faulkner.
Yes.
Faulkner wrote about the same kind of small communities.
It does remind me of Faulkner, and it's the richness of the description of the small community and the people there.
Being a world within.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Buy the book, please, and I'm sure Catherine would be glad to sign it for you.
I would. But thank you all for coming. I know
Thank
Leah
you.
wants to say a word. Is Leah here?
Yes.
Hi, Leah.
Oh, you came. Hi, Leah. Good.
Thank you all so much. Is it on, Lamont?
It's on.
Okay.
You can
Thank
use
you.
mine. Mine's even bigger.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah.
This was a wonderful program. I'm Leah from the Jew Center, and this is actually the last event of our year, 2024. I see some Jewish people around here, so thank you for this wonderful place, the Writer's Center, people in trees, surrounded by
By plants.
Trees.
Oh, I noticed that.
the world is coming together.
Yeah.
This is the end, and it's actually, we've had 64 writers from about 30 countries this year, over 36 programs, a couple dozen collaborators, and Plamen and the Writer's Center are two of our favorites. So thank you. Look forward to seeing you again at our next events, and thank you to the three of you, and to Roman, and to Zach, and everyone here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming out.
Thank you. Hope you got to see everything you wanted. It was lovely listening